He was arrested without cause, simply for being a black businessman in a luxury car. The police officers mocked him, humiliated him as if his success was a crime. But no one expected that in a few years he would become a judge who would dispense justice over them. Now, those very same people are sitting in the defendant's chair, while he is the one deciding their fate. The events that follow will shock even those who have heard many similar stories. But let's go back to the beginning. James Harrison was a successful black businessman, a self-made man. Owning several profitable companies in real estate and investment, he became a role model for many. Every time he thought of his achievements, his heart swelled with pride, especially in moments like this. One evening, after closing a multi-million-dollar deal, James was driving home in his brand new BMW. The car was a symbol of his success, a reward for all the years of hard work and dedication. The city's streets were almost empty, and the evening promised to be peaceful. James turned on some music, enjoying the well-deserved sense of triumph. His mind was filled with upcoming projects. He was planning a relaxing evening with his family. However, his peace was short-lived. Flashing blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. James frowned slightly, confused as to why he was being pulled over. He hadn't broken any rules. His speed was within the limit, and all his documents were in order. A routine check, he thought, pulling over without much concern. To his surprise, the police officers exited their car with abrupt, tense movements. One of them had his hand on his holster, as if preparing for something dangerous. James rolled down his window and, remaining polite, addressed the officers. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" "Step out of the car, sir," one of the officers snapped, not even bothering to explain the reason for the stop. This tone immediately raised James's suspicion. Typically, police officers in such situations first explain the reason for the stop or ask for documents, but something was clearly off here. Nonetheless, he decided not to argue. No need to escalate the situation. James opened the door and calmly got out of the car, feeling the tension building. "Excuse me, can I ask why I'm being stopped?" he asked, standing by the car door. The officers ignored his question. The second officer started circling his car, inspecting it as if trying to find something suspicious. The first one, with undisguised hostility, stared at James. "This car is too expensive for someone like you," the officer said dryly, looking at James with blatant disdain. Those words immediately struck James's pride. He felt anger boiling inside but tried to remain calm. He knew that every move he made could be used against him. However, such a statement was a glaring example of racial bias. "Sorry, what do you mean?" he asked calmly, trying to understand if this was really happening because of his skin color. "You know exactly what I mean," the officer said, ignoring James's attempt at a constructive dialogue. "We got a report about a suspicious car, and yours matches the description." James was stunned. His car, bought with his hard-earned money, became suspicious simply because a black man was driving it? He knew things like this happened, but he never thought it would happen to him, especially after all his success. "This is my car," James said calmly, trying not to show his irritation. "I can show you the documents." Instead of asking for the documents, the officer stepped closer and rudely said, "You don't ask questions here. Just do as you're told. You're a black guy too arrogant for your own good." The officer's words stung. James understood that this was no longer about a simple check. This was a demonstration of power and bias. He could feel the growing anger, but didn't want to give the officers a reason to act further. He knew that his success, his car, and his skin color had made him a target for these people. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly, raising his hands in a gesture of compliance. "I just want to know why I'm being stopped." These words seemed to anger the officers even more. One of them stepped forward and, without saying a word, grabbed James's arm and twisted it behind his back. It all happened so fast that James didn't have time to react. "You're under arrest for resisting," the second officer said coldly, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. James felt the cold steel cuffs tighten around his wrists and realized that his world had just turned upside down. In that moment, he understood that everything he had achieved didn't matter to these people. They only saw the color of his skin, and that was enough to make him a criminal in their eyes. When James felt his hands being roughly twisted behind his back and the cold handcuffs tightening around his wrists, he fully grasped the absurdity of what was happening. A successful businessman, a self-made man, arrested without any real charges. A wave of anger and helplessness surged in his mind, but he knew he had to stay calm to avoid worsening his situation. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding!" James shouted, trying to break free from the officer's grip as he was shoved face first against the hood of his car. "You can't just arrest me like this! I haven't done anything illegal!" "Shut up!" one of the officers spat, gripping his shoulders with such force that James felt a sharp pain in his back. "Your mouth is only going to dig you in deeper." The malicious tone only intensified the feeling of injustice. The police officers seemed to be enjoying the moment, seeing a successful black man stripped of his dignity. One of them sneered, "Think you can do whatever you want just because you have money? Not in our town. We know how guys like you hide their crap behind fancy cars and suits." These words were outright racial bias. James knew that the entire situation was built on false stereotypes. In the eyes of these people, he was nothing more than an arrogant black man who, in their opinion, used his position to hide crimes. They didn't see a successful businessman, father, or husband. They only saw a threat to their concept of order. "This is ridiculous," James said again, though his voice trembled with suppressed rage. "I have all the documents. I'm ready to show them. You're breaking the law." But his protests were futile. One of the officers roughly turned his face toward him and stared him straight in the eyes. "Resisting, huh? Well, now we've got something to book you for." James felt a push in his back, forcing him to bend over. A sense of helplessness overwhelmed him. Everything he had worked for all his life seemed to crumble in an instant. In that moment, it became clear to him that his arrest was not just a mistake or accident. It was the embodiment of systemic racism, against which he, despite all his success, was powerless. The police officers, without any concern for his comfort, began pushing him toward the patrol car. James tried to resist somehow, but knew that any movement would be interpreted as aggression. He tried to stay calm, but the inner indignation grew. This was not just an arrest, it was a deliberate humiliation, a conscious attempt to show that, in the eyes of the system, he was nothing. "You have no right," James said quietly as they pushed him toward the back door of the patrol car. "I have the right to call a lawyer." "You have no rights, black boy," one of the officers snapped, shoving him into the car. "Here, you're nobody." These words finally shattered James's composure. He sat in the back seat of the police car, feeling the anger and pain well up inside his chest. How was this possible? How in today's world, in the 21st century, could such blatant injustice exist? But at that moment, he realized one simple truth. For many, no matter how far you get, no matter how successful you become, the color of your skin will always matter. The police slammed the door and the car began to move, taking James to the police station. They didn't give him the opportunity to call a lawyer. His words, protests, and requests were met with complete disdain. Inside the patrol car, there was silence, broken only by his breathing and the sound of his heartbeat. James tried to process everything that had happened in those few minutes, but the realization of it all overwhelmed him with horror. Upon arrival at the police station, James was dragged out of the car and led inside. The feeling that his life was falling apart became more real with every step. When they brought him to a small cell, not even bothering to remove the handcuffs right away, he felt the dark void closing in on him. "We'll see you in a few hours, Mr. Harrison," one of the officers sneered as they locked him in. The heavy metal door closed with a dull thud, leaving James in complete darkness. He sat on the cold bench and realized that his world was crumbling right before his eyes. Success, money, influence, none of it mattered when the system was set against him. He was alone in this dark cell, stripped of his rights and freedom, realizing that his arrest was not just a mistake, but the result of deeply ingrained racism. At that moment, James understood that the fight was only beginning. The night in the prison cell dragged on slowly, as if time itself had slowed down. stretching each minute into an eternity. James sat on the hard metal bench, his hands still slightly aching from the handcuffs that had only just been removed. He leaned against the cold, damp wall, feeling its chill, which seemed to mirror his inner state. Everything that had happened over the past few hours had been a complete shock to him. A successful businessman, a man who took pride in his achievements and independence, now found himself in a situation where his skin color meant more than all his success. He tried to calm himself, but his thoughts wouldn't let him rest. A wave of anger and helplessness pulsed through his mind as he grappled with the injustice of it all. His face tightened in rage, but he knew that screaming or protesting in this cell was pointless. No one would hear him. No one would come to his aid. This was a place where he was truly alone, not just physically, but emotionally. James had always believed that his success would protect him from injustice. He thought that money, prestige, and his accomplishments in business would elevate him above racial prejudice, that he would be recognized as an individual, not just a black man. But this night in the cell shattered all his illusions. The system that was supposed to protect people had instead humiliated and broken his faith in justice. Finding himself behind bars without cause, he realized that the society he lived in didn't see him as a successful businessman, father, or husband. They only saw his skin color. As he recalled the last few years of his life, James felt anger boiling inside. He remembered how hard he had worked, how he had built his companies from the ground up, facing countless challenges and overcoming them. Every contract, every decision, every accomplishment. All of it now seemed insignificant in the face of this blatant injustice. In the eyes of the police officers, he was not a worthy citizen, not someone who had achieved success through honest work. He was simply a suspicious black man. His gaze drifted to the small window in the cell, through which a faint light from the street lamps barely penetrated. Beyond that window was freedom, the life he had been so proud of. But here, in this cell, everything seemed like an illusion. The world he had built over the years now lay in ruins. James thought about his colleagues, his family, and his friends. How would they react when they found out he had been arrested? What would his wife think? What would his son say when he heard that his father had been arrested without cause? These thoughts tortured him, deepening his sense of guilt for not being able to prevent this humiliation. But he also knew that the blame wasn't his. This was the result of a system that still saw black men as a threat, not as equals. His anger was replaced by a feeling of helplessness. He tried to make sense of everything that had happened, but his mind couldn't find an answer to the main question. How could this have happened to him, a successful and respected man? The system he had once believed in now showed its true face, and that face was filled with bias and hatred. Despite all these dark thoughts, one idea kept James from breaking down: the thirst for justice. He knew that he couldn't let the system defeat him. He had fought too long and hard to earn his place under the sun, and he wasn't going to give up now. James felt a growing resolve inside. He was no longer the man who would accept injustice. This cell, this night, they could not be the end of his story. This was only the beginning of a new chapter, where he would fight for truth, for his honor, and for a future where his son would not fall victim to the same discrimination. He knew he wasn't alone in his fight. Beyond these walls were people who would support him, who would understand his pain. He didn't know how much longer he would have to stay in this place, but one thing had become clear to him. He would never look at the system the same way again. Everything he had gone through that night had forever changed his view of the world. Now, his driving force was not just the desire for success, but also the pursuit of justice for himself and for all those who had suffered from prejudice. Clenching his fists, James lifted his head and firmly resolved that when he got out of here, he wouldn't just return to his life. He would fight for change, for the truth, for the justice that was so desperately lacking in the world. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight started to filter through the small window of the cell, the door creaked open. A cold and distant police officer announced, "Harrison, you're being released on bail." James slowly stood up from the hard bench, his body still bearing the traces of stress from the night in the jail cell. Every muscle was tense, and his mind was still simmering with the events of the previous night. Though these had been some of the hardest hours of his life, he remained confident that this day would mark the beginning of justice. As he was led into the station's lobby, he saw his lawyer, Richard Miller, standing at the counter. Richard was an experienced attorney, someone James knew well. Upon seeing James, the lawyer frowned and approached him to exchange their first words. "This is absurd, James," Richard said, shaking his client's hand. "I can't believe they arrested you over something so ridiculous. We'll fight this in court. They have no grounds for your detention." James nodded, but inside, his anger was boiling. He knew his lawyer would do everything possible to prove his innocence. However, for him, this case was about much more than just defense in court. It was a fight against the system that had humiliated him and struck at his dignity. As soon as James and Richard left the police station, they were met by several journalists. By this time, news of the unlawful arrest of a successful black businessman had already leaked to the media. Cameras and microphones were pointed in his direction, and the reporters, not waiting for his response, began firing off questions. "Mr. Harrison, is it true that you were arrested without any explanation? What do you think about the police's actions? Are you planning to file a lawsuit against the police department?" James paused for a moment, surveying the crowd, and gathering himself, he spoke. "What happened yesterday is a blatant example of systemic discrimination. I wasn't arrested because I broke the law, but because I'm a black man driving an expensive car. This wasn't justice. It was pure racism, and I won't stay silent about it." His words triggered a flurry of camera flashes and immediate attention from the reporters. James understood that his voice would now be heard. He wasn't just a victim of unlawful arrest anymore. He had become a symbol of the fight for justice. Soon, James Harrison's story began spreading across the news. His arrest sparked widespread discussion about racial bias in law enforcement. Social media exploded with discussions, with many people sharing similar stories of police discrimination. James realized that his personal tragedy had become part of a much larger issue affecting thousands, if not millions, of people. Meanwhile, Richard started preparing the documents to file a lawsuit against the city and the police department. James wasn't just going to defend his innocence. He wanted to hold those responsible for his arrest accountable. The lawsuit included demands for compensation for unlawful arrest, emotional distress, and the violation of his civil rights. "We must go all the way," James told his lawyer. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's faced similar injustice." Richard fully supported James in his resolve. He knew this case could become a landmark if they succeeded. It could set a precedent that would force the police and authorities to re-evaluate their actions and change the system from within. As preparations for the trial began, James decided to speak publicly on television. His speech was emotional and resonant. He talked about his experience, the humiliation and pain he had faced. But the main message of his address was that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a deeply rooted problem. "We can't stay silent anymore," James said in his statement. "I believe that my success would protect me, but this system sees us not as individuals, but by the color of our skin. I will not let this continue. I intend to fight for truth and justice, not just for myself, but for all those who face similar discrimination every day." His words sparked an outpouring of support. People from all over the country began writing to him, expressing their sympathy and encouragement. James received letters from others who had also been victims of police bias, and this only strengthened his resolve to keep fighting. That day became a turning point in his battle for justice. He was no longer just a successful businessman who had run into trouble. He had become a symbol of resistance against a system that had ignored the rights of people of color for centuries. And now, James knew that his goal was not just to win compensation for emotional distress, but to push for changes that would make society fairer for everyone. The legal proceedings in James Harrison's case began a few months after his arrest. The courtroom was filled with tension. This case had gained widespread public attention, and many understood that its outcome could set an important precedent. People had gathered at the hearings, not just for James, but to see whether justice would be served, or if the system would once again protect its representatives, as it had so often done. From the start, it became clear that the police's attorneys had chosen an aggressive defense. They attempted to discredit James, painting him as a dangerous black man who had allegedly behaved aggressively during his detention. One of the attorneys stated, "Mr. Harrison was detained as part of standard procedure, as his behavior raised suspicions. His car, worth over $100,000, was registered to a name that didn't match his appearance, which prompted further investigation." James felt the anger rise in him again. Didn't match his appearance? This wasn't just unjust. It was outright racial discrimination. He clenched his fists, but managed to keep his composure. At that moment, he realized that this trial wasn't just his personal battle. It was a symbolic fight for the rights of everyone who had faced similar injustice. The police's lawyers continued their attack, claiming that James had refused to comply with the lawful demands of the officers, which they argued led to his arrest. Mr. Harrison not only behaved aggressively, but also resisted arrest. One of the attorneys coldly stated, "We couldn't ignore his behavior, considering he was driving a suspiciously expensive vehicle." These words felt like yet another blow to James's reputation, but he was ready for such attacks. Instead of letting them break him, James drew on his entrepreneurial instincts. He knew that success in business required not just knowledge and skills, but also the ability to analyze, adapt, and bring attention to important details. At the hearings, James made a clear and convincing statement. "Your Honor, I am a successful businessman, and at the time of my arrest, I was simply driving home after closing an important deal. I wasn't stopped because I committed any crime, but because I'm a black man behind the wheel of an expensive car. What is being framed as suspicious behavior is, in fact, the result of bias and racism." He recounted how he behaved during the arrest, emphasizing that he hadn't resisted but was nonetheless roughly arrested without any explanation. James described the humiliation he felt when handcuffed, his dignity destroyed simply because he was a black man. The police's lawyers tried to interrupt him, but James continued, "What I went through is not just a random mistake. It's a systemic problem deeply rooted in law enforcement. When law officers judge people not by their actions, but by their skin color, it's a threat to every member of our society." The courtroom was filled with attention. Every word James spoke resonated not only with those present, but also beyond the courtroom walls. His statement began to draw even more media attention. Journalists covered every moment of the trial, and more people who had experienced racial bias began to express their support for James. The public rallied behind him. A social media campaign began in his support, with people demanding justice and punishment for the police officers involved in his arrest. James's story became a symbol of the broader fight against racism and police brutality. Witnesses, including bystanders who had seen his arrest, testified in James's defense, saying he had acted calmly and hadn't resisted, but was arrested only because of his appearance and status. This testimony further weakened the police's position in court. Meanwhile, James actively used his influence and entrepreneurial connections to draw attention to systemic issues within law enforcement. He gave interviews to journalists, appeared on television, and shared his story on social media, emphasizing that his case was just the tip of the iceberg. "This isn't just about me," James said in one of his interviews. "It's about everyone who's ever faced discrimination, about everyone who's been judged by their appearance and not their actions. We need to change the system so that no one else has to go through what I went through." Every day of the court proceedings was a challenge, but James kept fighting despite the pressure. He realized that his story had grown larger than himself. It was a battle for the future, where his son and other black men and women wouldn't fear walking down the street or driving a luxury car because they might be arrested for suspicious behavior. James's resolve to fight not only for his freedom, but also for systemic change, grew stronger with each passing day. His goal became clear: to seek justice for himself and to use his story as a platform for a broader fight against systemic racism. Each court session was a step forward in his struggle. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a symbol of change, supported by thousands of people across the country. After weeks of legal proceedings and tense anticipation, The court finally delivered its verdict. James Harrison's arrest was declared unlawful. The court ruled that the actions of the police were driven by racial bias and had no legitimate basis. Furthermore, the city's police department was found guilty of violating James's civil rights and was ordered to pay him significant compensation for emotional distress. When James heard the verdict, he felt relief, but it wasn't the kind of relief he expected. Yes, it was a victory. His name had been cleared, his honor restored. The police officers who had humiliated him were held accountable, and the public witnessed yet another example of the injustice black people face. However, despite this outward victory, James felt that the compensation and acknowledgement of his innocence weren't enough. Sitting in the courtroom after the verdict was read, he realized that his life had changed. This case had upended his worldview, shattering his old beliefs that success and status could protect him from racism. He understood that while fighting for justice on an individual level was important, it didn't address the deeper problems rooted in the system. Money won't solve the problem, he thought as he left the courthouse. Returning to his old life as a businessman now seemed pointless. His personal story had become a symbol of the fight against the system, but he knew that to truly change the world, it would take more than just winning in court. He needed to become part of the system and fight injustice from within. The next day, after hours of reflection, James made the decision to change his life. He decided to leave business behind and dedicate himself to the fight for justice. To do so, he knew he needed to become a lawyer and eventually a judge, not only to defend the innocent, but to reform the system that allowed racism to thrive. The path ahead seemed long and difficult, but James was determined. He knew this would be a challenging transition, especially for someone his age, but something inside him screamed that this was the right decision. He could no longer stand by as a passive observer, silently harboring his pain and indignation. His experience and his battle in court had become a catalyst for a deeper mission. First, he discussed his decision with his attorney, Richard Miller, who had represented him in court. Richard was surprised when he heard that James wanted to leave his successful business and start from scratch by enrolling in law school. "Are you sure about this, James?" Richard asked skeptically. "It's a long road, and the system won't change overnight. But if anyone can change it, it's you." James nodded, resolute in his decision. "I can't go back to life as if nothing happened," he replied. "This fight isn't over. I want to do more than just be a successful businessman. I want to change the system that keeps tearing down people like me." James began preparing for the law school entrance exams. His days were filled with studying, deep thought, and planning. He understood perfectly that this wasn't just a career move. It was a life mission, a calling he was now devoted to. His new goal wasn't about making money or achieving status. Now, he wanted to become part of those fighting for justice and the rights of those betrayed by the system. The first step was tough, but James knew that this decision would change his life forever. His years in law school were filled with challenges, but every time he faced difficulties, he remembered that night in the jail cell. He remembered the humiliation, the pain, and the injustice he had endured, and that only strengthened his resolve. He felt that every obstacle, every case he studied, was a step on the path to not just defending people, but to delivering justice. During his studies, James delved into the history of the judicial system, human rights, and civil liberties. His interest increasingly focused on cases involving racial discrimination and police brutality. He participated in student debates and spoke out actively on the need for reform in law enforcement and the justice system. His experience and intimate knowledge of the problem gave him a unique perspective that his peers didn't possess. As he progressed in his studies, James realized that his ultimate goal was to become a judge. He wanted to be the one making decisions, the one who could directly impact justice and protect the rights of those the system had failed. His mission wasn't just to defend the innocent, but to change the system itself, making it more just and humane. Years passed, but his determination never wavered. James successfully completed his legal education and began practicing as a lawyer. He immediately specialized in civil rights cases. His clients were people who, like him, had faced bias and injustice. Every case was personal to him. Every case reminded him of his own experience. James became a symbol of the fight for truth and justice, not only for himself, but for his community. As a lawyer and later as a judge, he not only defended people in court, but actively pushed for reforms in the legal system. His goal remained unchanged: to reform the system from within so that no one else would have to go through what he had. This wasn't just a decision to change careers. It was a decision to change his life and the lives of many others. When James Harrison made the decision to leave his successful business and dedicate himself to a legal education, he knew it would be a long and difficult journey. But he also knew that this step was necessary if he truly wanted to change the system from within. Law school became a new challenge for him, but at the same time, it was a source of inspiration. It was an opportunity to acquire the knowledge and tools he could use to fight the injustice and racial bias he had personally experienced. Upon entering law school, James immediately immersed himself in his studies. He had to adapt to a completely new environment, where his business experience did not carry the same weight as before. Here, it wasn't his deals and contracts that were valued, but his knowledge of the law and ability to think analytically. Despite his past successes, James felt as if he had to start from scratch again. Legal education turned out to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. Every day, he spent several hours studying legislative acts, legal precedents, and constitutional law. But instead of simply going with the flow, James approached his studies with the same determination that had helped him build his business. He understood that this path was his new chance, not only for personal success, but to impact the lives of others. However, from the very beginning, James encountered a new form of discrimination. Many of his classmates, and even some professors, looked at him with skepticism. It was unusual for them to see a black man who had once been a businessman among future lawyers. Stereotypes that someone with his background could not become a successful and respected lawyer, let alone a judge, were still too strong. One student once said, not hiding his mockery, "You're going to have a hard time, Harrison. You need to study a lot here, not just close deals like in your business." Those words stung James, but he didn't allow himself to respond to the provocation. He understood that these people saw him as a threat to their familiar way of life. Yet another encounter with bias made him realize that racism and stereotypes could penetrate not only the police, but also academic circles. His success in business seemed like a fluke to many, and they didn't believe that someone with his background could reach the heights of the legal field. James often asked himself, why is this happening even here? But each time he found the answer in his fight for justice. His path was difficult not only because of the complexity of his studies, but also because he constantly had to prove his competence and worth. He knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. Every action or word could be used against him. In law school, James also encountered professors who doubted his intentions and motivations. One of them, known for his conservative stance, directly asked him during one of the lectures, "Mr. Harrison, do you really believe that a businessman can make a good judge? After all, a judge needs a complete understanding of the law, not just knowledge of how to run a business and sign contracts." Those words sounded like a challenge, but without hesitation, James responded, "I believe a judge needs to understand not only the law, but also the lives of the people he sentences. My business taught me to make decisions that impact the lives of others, and legal education will give me the tools to make sure those decisions are fair." His confident response silenced many, but James knew that he still had a long road ahead of him. He needed not only to master complex legal concepts, but also to overcome the bias that surrounded him at every step. As time went on, James became more deeply involved in his studies. He took on the most challenging tasks, proving that he could handle any challenge. Every day was dedicated to studying and practical assignments, spending hours in the library and attending seminars. His thirst for knowledge was unwavering, and his desire to change the system only grew stronger with every new case he studied. Despite all the difficulties, James began to earn the respect of some of his classmates and professors. They saw that he wasn't just studying law, but wanted to improve it. In every word and action, there was a passion for justice and an understanding of how important it was to fight for the rights of those who could be victims of discrimination. In law school, he also began to take an interest in cases related to civil rights violations and police brutality. His experience of being personally arrested served as a constant reminder of the importance of reforming the justice system. James often raised questions about police reform and the need to protect the rights of those suffering from bias. His views and ideas gradually began to gain support from other students and some professors. Law school became not just a place of study, it was a school of life. James understood that his journey was just beginning, and even more difficult challenges awaited him in the future. But every step on this path strengthened his resolve. He no longer saw himself as just a businessman who had decided to change careers. Now, he was a future lawyer, and eventually a judge, ready to use his knowledge and experience to fight systemic injustice. Years passed, and James graduated from law school with honors, proving to everyone who had doubted his abilities that he was worthy of this path. But most importantly, he proved it to himself. New horizons were now opening before him, and he was ready to continue his fight for justice. It had been a year since James Harrison had taken the bench as a judge. That year had been filled with cases, each offering him the opportunity to protect the rights of those who had been overlooked or mistreated by the system. He administered justice with unwavering determination, seeking to correct the wrongs that had once oppressed him. But there was one case he had been waiting for, a case that was especially important to him. The case against the police officers who had once unlawfully arrested James had finally returned to court. This case was personal. It wasn't just about proving their guilt. It represented for him and for society that justice could be achieved even where it once seemed impossible. Now, as the presiding judge on this case, James knew that his duty was not only to deliver a verdict, but to give this story the closure it deserved. On that fateful day, as James entered the courtroom, his gaze settled on the very same police officers who had once laughed at him. Now, they sat on the defendant's bench, no longer confident in their impunity as they had been before. Their faces were serious, fearful. The system they had once used to suppress the innocent had now turned against them. James felt no malice. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that this was the moment when law and justice would finally prevail. The case was both simple and complex. It wasn't just about abuse of power. It was about the systemic discrimination that had allowed such police officers to act with impunity. James had reviewed the case files with cold objectivity, despite it being deeply tied to his own life. He understood that as a judge, he was obligated to consider all the facts impartially, but he also knew that the truth was on his side. The prosecutor made a powerful opening statement, describing the officer's actions on the day James was arrested. Witnesses who had been present at the scene confirmed that James had not resisted arrest, that he had remained calm and tried to explain his situation. All the evidence pointed to the fact that the police officers had acted out of prejudice and racial stereotypes, not out of any legitimate legal reason. When it came time for the police officers' defense, their attorneys attempted to justify their actions, citing professional necessity and claiming that at the time they were acting in the interest of public safety. But these words felt hollow in light of the overwhelming evidence presented in court. James listened intently, but he felt no sympathy. These individuals were not just police officers. They were representatives of a system that, for years, had oppressed him and so many others. As the time came for James to deliver the verdict, he realized this moment would mark the culmination of his long fight for justice. He spoke calmly, but with determination, addressing the courtroom. "We are here not only to examine this specific case, but also to acknowledge that systemic issues of bias and discrimination still exist in our society. This case is a stark example of how authorities can abuse their power when acting based on stereotypes and prejudice, rather than facts and the law." James looked at the police officers, whose heads were now lowered. He could see that they understood the weight of their guilt, even if they tried to hide it behind indifferent faces. "After thoroughly reviewing all the evidence, I have concluded that the actions of the defendants were not only illegal, but were driven by racial bias. These actions not only violated the law, but also undermined public trust in those who are supposed to protect us." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. The courtroom was so silent that every breath could be heard. The defendants are found guilty of abuse of power, racism, and discrimination. Their actions violated the civil rights of an innocent man and damaged the reputation of the entire justice system. They will be punished according to the law. The verdict was delivered. The police officers who had once thought themselves untouchable were now to face the consequences of their crimes. James watched as they were taken into custody, and he felt a deep sense of closure, knowing that the journey that had started with his unjust arrest had now come full circle. Justice had been served,